The dog sat at the edge of their land every single morning. Same spot, same direction. Due north toward the wall of red rock that locals called Redwall Rim, the kind of country that swallowed men whole and gave nothing back. Nora Calfield watched him from the porch, coffee going cold in her hands. Everyone else had looked at that dog and seen a waste of feed. Gideon Pruitt had tied him to a post and forgotten him. The hands at the Pruitt ranch had laughed. Even Dale, her husband, the steadiest man she knew, had looked at that crooked, mismatched animal and seen nothing worth keeping. But Nora had spent 58 years noticing the things other people walked past, and that dog wasn't staring at nothing. His ears shifted. His nose worked the cold air in long, slow pulls. His eyes moved, tracking something invisible from where she stood, something that lived in the distance, something only he remembered. She didn't know yet what was up there. She didn't know that following him would save their land, their marriage, and everything they had spent 7 years building on rock and stubbornness and love. She only knew one thing standing on that porch in the thin October light. That dog was not looking at empty hills. He was looking at home. And sooner or later, she was going to follow him there. The dog sat at the edge of their land every single morning. Same spot, same direction. Due north toward the wall of red rock that locals called Redwall Rim. The kind of country that swallowed men whole and gave nothing back. Nora Calfield watched him from the porch, coffee going cold in her hands. The October air coming down off the hills with that particular bite that meant winter was not asking permission this year. It was just arriving. The dog's name was Soot, because of the color, or the lack of it. Gray and black and dirty white all at once, patches running every direction like someone had started 3 different dogs and finished none of them. One ear stood up straight, the other folded over at the tip. His back had a slight curve to it that made him look perpetually apologetic. His paws were enormous, comically heartbreakingly enormous, like he'd been assembled from spare parts by someone working in low light. Gideon Pruitt had found him near the high passes of Redwall Rim the previous winter. Half-starved, alone. No tag, no brand, no explanation. Gideon had taken him in, tried to work him, and spent 3 months waiting for the dog to do something useful. Soot had declined. He would not drive cattle, would not guard the henhouse, would not fetch or heel or respond to any command with anything more than a patient, considering look that seemed to say he understood the request perfectly and had decided against it. What Soot would do was sit and stare north, every morning, without fail, like a compass that only had one direction. So Gideon had tied him to a post and forgotten him. And when Nora and Dale had come to the Pruitt place to trade eggs for salt and nails, Gideon had offered the dog the way a man offers something he's embarrassed to still have. Take him, free. Saves me the trouble of running him off. That had been 2 weeks ago, and now Soot sat at the edge of their land every morning and stared north toward Redwall Rim. And Nora stood on the porch and watched him. And the coffee went cold, and the October light came down thin and pale over the Harrow Hills. And somewhere in the distance, the red rock cliffs caught the early sun and turned the color of old rust. Dale thought she had lost her mind. He hadn't said it in those exact words. Dale Calfield was not a man who said things in their exact words when a raised eyebrow would accomplish the same result. But the eyebrow had been very raised that day at the Pruitt place, and it had stayed raised more or less for 2 weeks. Nora didn't entirely blame him. They had 40 acres of rocky Wyoming foothills that fought them every season. They had a handful of cattle that were not thriving on land that had never been suited to cattle. They had a debt with the Harrow County Bank that was growing the way debts do when you're not watching closely enough, and sometimes even when you are. They had a root cellar that was not as full as it should be going into November. They had each other, which was more than some people had, and which Nora reminded herself of regularly, especially on the evenings when Dale got quiet in that particular way that meant he was doing arithmetic in his head and the numbers were not cooperating. What they did not have was room for a dog that did not work. Nora knew this. She knew it the way she knew the sound the wind made before a hard freeze. The way she knew which of their 4 remaining cattle was going to give trouble before it gave trouble. The way she knew without being told when Dale had a headache, when the axle on the wagon needed grease, when the morning was going to turn mean by afternoon. She knew things. She had always known things. The quiet, knowing, the kind that didn't announce itself, the kind that her mother had called being observant, and her older brothers had called being strange, and her father had simply called it Nora. She'd had 58 years of people walking past the things she noticed. She was not going to walk past this dog. The morning Gideon Pruitt had offered him Nora had crouched down in the Pruitt yard and looked at Soot straight on, eye level. The way old Amos Brierly had once told her, you had to look at a frightened animal. Low, patient, unhurried, as though you had all day and no particular interest in the outcome. Soot had looked back at her, not the way a scared dog looks, not cringing, not showing teeth, not the frantic eagerness of an animal desperate to please. He had looked at her the way a thoughtful person looks at another thoughtful person at a dinner party when everyone else is talking too loud. A quiet, considered look, an assessing look. Then he had turned and looked north, and Nora had felt the hair rise on her arms because his eyes moved when he looked north. Not the blank, unfocused stare of an animal daydreaming. His ears shifted. His nostrils flared and worked. He was reading something in the distance, something specific and real, and the intensity of his attention was the most purposeful thing she'd seen in a long time. She'd stood up and said, "We'll take him." And that was when the eyebrow happened. The drive home from Pruitt's had been quiet in the specific way that Dale and Nora's disagreements were often quiet. Dale drove the wagon. Nora sat beside him. Soot sat in the wagon bed, facing backward, watching the Pruitt land recede, and said nothing, which put him one up on both of them. After about a mile, Dale said, "We can barely feed ourselves." Nora said, "I know." He said, "A dog that won't work eats just as much as a dog that will." She said, "I know that too." He said, "Gideon Pruitt has run stock for 30 years, and he couldn't find a use for that animal." She said, "Gideon Pruitt also married his barn, practically speaking, and hasn't looked at anything new since 1887. Dale did not have an immediate response to that. The road went on. The wagon wheels found every rut. Soot kept watching the hills grow smaller behind them, ears working nose up. "He's looking at something," Nora said quietly. Dale glanced back at the dog. "He's looking at the hills. He's looking at something in the hills. There's a difference." Dale faced forward again. His jaw did the thing it did when he was deciding whether to say more or less. He decided on less. The horses walked on. The Harrow Hills came up around them, big and old and red in the afternoon light. They didn't speak again until they reached home. That night was harder. That night, Dale sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open, and the numbers were doing what numbers did, and somewhere around the 3rd column, he closed the book very carefully and said, "We have until spring, Nora. That's what we have. The bank needs real payment by spring, or they start asking questions we can't answer." She said, "I know." He said, "We don't have the margin for experiments." She said, "I know." He said, "I've followed you on a lot of things. The chickens, when we couldn't afford the feed. The second quarter-acre of kitchen garden when we barely worked the first. The decision to stay in Harrow Hills when both our families said we were fools for buying this ground. She said, and he looked up from the closed ledger. His face was tired. Not angry, just tired in the deep way that men get tired when they have been trying very hard for a very long time and the result keeps refusing to cooperate. And I would do it all again, he said. Every bit of it. But Nora, the dog. I know about the dog. Then why? Because I know what I saw, Dale. You saw a dog staring at a hill. I saw a dog that knows something. The silence between them was the kind that had texture. The kind that meant they had both said their piece and neither piece was wrong, and that was somehow worse than one of them being wrong. Dale closed his eyes for a moment, opened them, said if it so much as looks sideways at the chickens, it won't. You don't know that. She looked at him steadily. You're right. I don't. He was quiet another moment. Then he got up and went to bed. And in the morning, Soot was still there, lying across the threshold of the cabin door, like he had decided the door was his responsibility, and Dale stepped over him without saying anything, which was its own kind of answer. The weeks that followed were a study in patience and small wonders. Soot would not herd. This remained true. Their 4 cattle ignored him, and he ignored them back with mutual and complete indifference. Dale had tried once half-heartedly to see whether the dog might move a heifer that had wandered to the wrong end of the pasture. Soot had watched the experiment with polite interest and then walked away. The heifer stayed where she was. Dale had moved her himself, but things happened around Soot that Nora catalogued carefully. The first happened in the second week of October. Their doe goat, a nervous, high-strung animal named for no reason Nora could recall. Mrs. Percy was in the middle of a difficult birth. The kid came wrong. Nora was there, had been there for 2 hours in the cold of the barn. Her hands doing what needed doing, the goat in distress, the whole thing going badly. And then Soot came in and lay down 3 feet from the goat's head. Just lay down. Calm as still water. And Mrs. Percy, in the middle of her crisis, looked at the dog, and something in her breathing changed, slowed. The panic that had been tightening her muscles for an hour eased by degrees. The kid came 20 minutes later. 2 of them, actually. Dale had been standing in the barn doorway, and he did not say anything. But he looked at the dog a long time before he went back to the house. The second thing happened 4 days later. A barn cat had kittens in the hayloft. One fell. Nora heard it from across the yard, that particular thin needle cry of a newborn animal in trouble. By the time she got to the barn, Soot had already climbed up to the loft, an extraordinary feat for an animal with his particular geometry, and was carrying the kitten back down the ladder in his mouth. Not gripping it, cradling it. The kitten had stopped crying by the time he reached the bottom rung. The third thing was the one that stayed with Nora longest. Their oldest cow, a heavy red animal they called Margaret, took sick in the 3rd week of October. A respiratory thing. Nothing fatal, probably, but enough to make her miserable and skittish, flinching at sounds pacing her stall, unable to settle. They'd had the vet out from Harrow Falls twice. Margaret improved some, and then didn't. She wasn't eating right. Nora found Soot in Margaret's stall one morning. He had simply gone in and lain down in the straw in the corner. Not touching the cow, just present, just there. And Margaret was eating. Methodically, without fuss, pulling hay from the rack, with the calm efficiency of an animal that had stopped being afraid of whatever was frightening her. Nora stood at the stall door for a long time. He's not a working dog, she thought. He's a calming dog. Whatever he does, it's not driving or guarding or any of the things people mean when they say a dog should work. He makes frightened things feel safe. She thought about what old Amos Brierly had said the last time she'd seen him. Amos had come through Harrow Hills in September, the way he came through every year or two, moving slow, now his beard gone fully white, leaning on his stick. He'd stopped at their fence and looked at the land the way old men who have worked land their whole lives look at it, reading it like a book. Then he'd looked at Nora. A creature folks overlook, he'd said, without particular preamble, is not necessarily a creature with nothing to offer. Mostly, it's just a creature nobody looked at long enough to find out what it has. He'd walked on. She'd thought at the time he was talking about the land. Standing at Margaret's stall, watching the dog and the cow in their quiet arrangement, she thought maybe he hadn't been. The morning she understood about the direction came in the 3rd week of October. She'd been watching Soot's morning ritual for days, that northward vigil, the way he settled into it like a man settling into prayer. Steady, certain, unhurried. And she realized one morning, coffee in hand on the porch in the early light, that she had been watching without really looking. She corrected that. She stood very still, and she watched where he was watching. Redwall Rim. She knew the name. Everyone in Harrow Hills knew the name. The ridge of red sandstone that cut across the northern horizon, rising 600 or 700 feet in great broken plates and columns the color of old iron, in some lights the color of dried blood in others. 3 miles of vertical chaos, deadened canyons branching off canyons, slot passages that looked like doors, and mostly weren't a maze that had killed 2 prospectors in 1901 and swallowed a surveying team in 1908 and discouraged everyone since. No one ran stock up there. No one went up there at all if they could help it. Gideon Pruitt had found Soot near the high passes of Redwall Rim, half-starved, alone, not wandering, near the passes, as though he had come from somewhere beyond and come down for reasons of his own. Nora stood very still on the porch and thought about that. He doesn't look like a dog that got lost, she thought. He looks like a dog that knows exactly where he is and exactly where he wants to be. And those are 2 different places. And every morning he sits between them and waits. She went inside and found the county land map in the drawer where it had lived since they bought the property. She spread it on the kitchen table and found Redwall Rim and traced it with her finger. Dale came in from feeding and looked at what she was doing. "Nora," he said. She looked up. His face was careful, the face of a man who recognized a certain expression on his wife and was already preparing himself for what came after. She said, "How long has it been since anyone went into Redwall Rim?" He said. "No one goes into Redwall Rim," she said. "I know. How long?" He said, "That's not a question with an answer, because it's not a thing people do." She said Gideon found Soot near the high passes. Dale poured himself coffee, leaned against the counter. "Said I know where Gideon found him." She said, "A dog doesn't climb into rough country like that for nothing. He came from somewhere. Something up there is pulling him back." The coffee steam rose between them. Dale said, "Or he wandered up and nearly died, and we've given a stray mutt more credit than he's earned." "Maybe," she said. She looked back at the map. "But Dale, look at him every morning. That is not a dog remembering a bad experience. That is a dog remembering something worth going back to." Dale was quiet. The map lay between them. Redwall Rim, in its faint contour lines, all those canyon marks, the broken topography of country that had resisted every attempt to read it. He finally said, "And what exactly do you think is up there?" She said, "I don't know yet." He said, "Nora." She looked up. His face was tired. Not the angry tired of their fight 2 weeks ago. The other kind. The kind she knew better than she knew almost anything. The tired of a man who has been hoping for a long time and is afraid of hoping again and is hoping anyway. He said, "If we go up there and it's nothing, she said. Then we've spent a cold day on a hard trail and we come home, he said. And if it's something. She looked at him for a moment. Steady, certain. She said, then we come home different. He put down his coffee, rubbed his face with both hands the way he did when he was arriving at a decision he didn't entirely like. Then he straightened up and said, All right, we do this careful. Rope, water, enough supplies for a night if it comes to that. We tell Hester Crane where we're headed before we go. Nora was already reaching for her coat. Dale said, and the dog leads. If he stops, we stop. If he turns back, we turn back. This is his expedition. She paused with her hand on her coat and looked at him. He said, Don't look at me like that. She said, I'm just looking at you. He said, You're doing the look. She said, What look? He said, The look that means you're right, and you know it, and you're being gracious about it. It's worse than gloating. She put on her coat. Outside through the window, Soot sat at the edge of their land, facing north, patient as stone, waiting for someone to finally be ready. We leave at first light, Nora said, and for the first time in longer than she could easily remember, she went to bed that night without lying awake. The letter came the next morning. It arrived with the supply rider from Harrow Falls, tucked in with the usual circulars and one bill from the feed merchant, and if it had arrived one day later, Nora and Dale would already have been in the hills and would not have seen it until they came home. It came from the Harrow County Bank. It was brief. It was formal. It said that given the current arrears on the Caulfield property loan, and given the bank's reassessment of collateral value in the current season, the bank was requesting a meeting at the earliest opportunity to discuss the account. Dale read it standing at the kitchen table and then read it again. Then he set it down. He didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, They're not waiting until spring. Nora read it, felt the cold of it settle somewhere below her ribs. She said, It says a meeting. It doesn't say. He said, I know what it says. I also know what it means. They're getting ready to move on us, Nora, before spring. If we go into those hills and come back with nothing, we may not have until spring to fix it. She sat down, looked at the letter, looked at the map still spread on the table from yesterday. Outside the window, Soot sat at the edge of the land. North, always north. She said, Then we can't afford to come back with nothing. He said, That is not a comforting reframe of the situation. She said, Dale, look at him. He didn't want to, but he looked. The dog sat in the thin light of early morning, with his mismatched ears and his overlarge paws, and his one slightly apologetic posture, facing the one direction he had faced every morning for 3 weeks without deviation or doubt or apparent second thought. Dale looked at him for a long time. He said, We leave tomorrow. First light. Nora folded the bank letter and put it in the drawer with the map. She said yes. He said, Rope and water and supplies for a night. She said, Already planning. He said, And if it's nothing? She said, Then we figure out the bank. He said, And if it's something? She didn't answer right away. She looked at Soot, at the long, patient line of him against the morning sky. Then she said, Then everything changes. That night, she sat on the porch steps long after Dale had gone in. Cold enough that her breath came out in small clouds and the stars were the hard, bright kind you only got in deep autumn, punched clear through a sky with nothing between you and them. Soot came and lay at her feet. She had taken to working the mats from his coat in the evenings, slow and careful with the comb, talking low the way she talked, when she needed to hear herself think. He had learned to lean into the comb, and make a low sound that was almost a sigh. She said quietly into the dark, "You know something none of the rest of us do." And everyone looked at you and saw the wrong thing. The bad coat, the crooked back, the ears that don't match. She combed through a tangle. He leaned in. She said, "I know what that's like, being the one people look past, thinking you must be what they're seeing because they look so sure." She had been the youngest of 6, the quiet one, the one who noticed things and said so and was told she was imagining. She'd married Dale Calfield at 27 and moved to Harrow Hills at 29 and spent 7 years learning what stubbornness and love and work could build on ground that did not want to cooperate. She knew about not being taken seriously. She knew about looking like less than you were. She looked down at the dog. He looked up at her. Those mismatched eyes. Patient and certain and deeply specifically alive. She said, "I see you." Soot put his heavy head down on her knee and sighed. Something passed between them in the cold dark. The kind of thing that doesn't have a name. The kind that doesn't need one. She stayed out until the cold got serious. Then she went inside and laid out the rope and the water canisters and the supply pack and the extra blankets. She checked the packs twice. She set her boots by the door. She lay down next to Dale, who was already asleep, and stared at the dark ceiling of their cabin. Tomorrow, she thought. Outside, soot settled across the threshold. The stars moved their slow wheel overhead. The red rock of Redwall Rim stood in the dark 3 miles north, keeping whatever it was keeping. Patient as the dog who remembered it. Patient as the woman who had finally decided to look. They left before sunrise. The sky was the color of a bruise healing, purple at the edges, going gray in the middle. The horses exhaled great clouds into the cold, and Soot stood at the gate and watched them finish loading with the patience of someone who had been waiting a long time and was not surprised it had taken this long. Nora clipped the long lead to his collar. Not to restrain him, just to keep contact, just to feel the line between them. The moment the clip snapped shut, something changed. The loose, uncertain quality Soot had carried for 3 weeks, that air of a creature between two places, fell away like a coat he'd been wearing against his will. His spine straightened. His bad ear came halfway up. His enormous paws found the ground differently, purposeful, certain. He stepped north. Dale watched this from beside the horse. Didn't say anything. But Nora saw his jaw shift, the way it did when he was revising something he had believed. They climbed. The first mile was easy enough. Grass and juniper on long rolling slopes, the land lifting gently toward the base of the red cliffs. The morning came in slow and pale over the eastern hills behind them, and the shadows ran long ahead of them, and Soot moved through it all with his nose working, and his mismatched ears tracking separate sounds in separate directions, and his whole body saying one word clearly. Forward. The second mile was different. The ground turned. Soft earth became broken shale, became bare rock, and the trail, if it had ever been a trail, dissolved into suggestion, and then into nothing at all. The red walls of Redwall Rim rose on 3 sides now, and the canyons began. Not gentle valleys, slot canyons narrow and shadowed, and cold, the walls pressing in until the sky above became a winding ribbon of pale blue high overhead, and the air went still and strange. Dale stopped at the first branching. 3 directions. All of them looked identical. All of them looked like mistakes. He said, "Which way?" Nora looked at Soot. Soot had already turned left, standing in the mouth of the left passage looking back at them, waiting. Dale looked at the left passage, then at the other two, then at the dog. He said left. They went left. 20 minutes in the passage ended, or appeared to. A wall of red sandstone, solid and sheer, filling the canyon from side to side. Dale pulled up and looked at it and looked at Nora and said nothing, but his face said several things in sequence. Soot walked to the far right edge of the wall, where it met the canyon side, and pressed through a fold in the rock that from 10 feet away was invisible. A gap barely wide enough for a person. 6 inches wider than the packed horse. They got the horse through sideways, Dale going first leading, his shoulders brushing both walls at once, the pack scraping stone, the horse not happy about any of it and expressing this clearly. On the other side, Dale stood and looked back at the gap. He said, "I would have turned us around there." Nora said, "I know." He said, "I was completely certain that was a wall." She said, "I know." He looked at Soot. He said, "Don't say anything." She said I wasn't going to say a word. She was absolutely going to say several words later at an appropriate moment. But not now. Now she watched Dale process the experience of being wrong about something he had been completely certain of, and she gave him the gift of doing it privately. They went on. The passages twisted and climbed. The walls rose higher. The sky narrowed to nothing and then widened again as they moved from slot into chamber into slot. Cold in the shadows. Briefly warm where a shaft of midday sun found the canyon floor. The sound of their boots and the horse's shoes echoing off stone in ways that made the sounds come back wrong too close to many. Soot never hesitated. At every branching, and there were 7 more Nora counted he chose without pause. No sniffing the ground to decide. No circling uncertainty. Just a direction, clear as a pointed finger. The second false wall happened 2 hours in. Another apparent dead end. This one even more convincing. Dale stood in front of it, and Nora watched him look at it and look at the dog and make the calculation in real time. This time, it took him about 4 seconds. He said, "Far left edge." The gap was there, tighter than the last one. The horse objected more strenuously. They got through. Dale didn't say anything on the other side, but he reached down and touched Soot briefly on the head. Once. Quick. Like he didn't want to make a production of it. Soot accepted this as no more than his due and walked on. The passage ahead was the narrowest yet. The walls close enough to touch on both sides without extending your arms fully. The sky above a thread. The horse's breath loud and warm in the confined space. Their own breath joining it. The cold, deep, and still. And then, ahead, a brightness. Not the pale gray light they had been walking in for hours. A different quality. Warmer. Fuller. The light of open sky falling on something it had room to fall on. Soot quivered at the end of the lead. Every muscle in his body pulled toward that light. A single low sound came from his chest. Not a bark, not a whimper. Something between them. Something that sounded to Nora like recognition. He pulled them forward. They stepped out of the slot canyon and the walls fell away on all sides, and the cow fields stopped walking and stopped breathing and stood completely still. A valley, hidden so completely within its ring of stone that it had no existence from outside. Perhaps 2 miles long, a mile wide, cupped like a palm between the peaks. Invisible from every ridge, every approach, every angle of the outside world. And it was green. After the dry red maze they had crossed, after miles of bare stone and dead canyons, and the particular desolation of rock country in late October, this valley was an impossible green. A spring-fed stream wound down its center, clear and quick, catching the midday light in small flashes. The grass grew tall and silver-green, bending slightly in a wind that seemed to belong only to the valley, gentle and warm, in a way the canyon country was not. Cottonwoods and aspens lined the water, their late October leaves still holding gold. Wildflowers, actual wildflowers, yellow and pale blue, drifting in patches across the valley floor. Nora could not speak. She tried. Nothing came. Dale stood beside her. His hand found hers without either of them looking. Just found it, the way hands do after 30 years of practice. And then she saw them. Dale. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. Dale. Look. He was already looking. Sheep. Not a few. Not a small, wandering group. Sheep spread across the valley floor in loose, unhurried clusters. Along the stream, up the gentle slopes, gathered in the shade of the cottonwood groves. Sheep everywhere she looked, and the more she looked, the more she found tucked into the grass, moving in slow drifts along the water. Their fleece was long. Years of long growing in great woolly tangles that dragged at the ground heavy and dense and completely unshorn. Half wild from however many seasons on their own, but healthy. Fat, even. The grass was that good. The water that steady. The walls around them that complete. A whole flock, living free. In a hidden green heaven that the hard red country outside had been keeping secret from everyone. Soot sat down at Nora's feet, and for the first time since they had brought him home, he stopped looking north. Because he was there. He was finally, completely, already there. His tail moved against the grass, slow and certain. His tongue came out. His mismatched eyes swept the valley with an expression that Nora had no adequate word for, except perhaps peace. He had not been staring at nothing. He had been remembering this. Dale laughed. It came out of him sudden and startled and genuine. The laugh of a man who has spent a long time in the serious business of survival and has just been ambushed by something wonderful. It bounced off the canyon walls and came back to them different. Bigger. He said, Nora. She said, I see it. He said, those are sheep. That's a hole. She said, I know. He said, there must be how many do you? She said, a lot. Keep counting. He counted, stopped counting, started again. He said, Nora, this is everything. Do you understand what this is? This is the ranch. This is the bank. This is 10 years of wool going to the railhead in Harrow Falls. This is all of it. This is the thing we have been trying to find our way to for 7 years, and it was here the whole time, and a dog nobody wanted knew where it was. She was already kneeling in the grass with her arms around Soot's shaggy, mismatched neck, her face in the fur that smelled of canyon dust and something older. Something she couldn't name. She said into his neck quietly so Dale wouldn't hear the way her voice broke on it. You knew. The whole time. You knew exactly where it was, and you just needed someone to finally follow you. Soot leaned into her, heavy and warm. His tail knocked against the ground. The valley spread around them in the October light green and still and full. The trouble with miracles is that the morning after the work begins. They spent the night in the valley, built a small fire near the stream. The sheep gave them wide, cautious looks from a distance, but did not bolt. Soot settled near the flock's edge, and the animals nearest to him gradually stopped watching and went back to grazing, which told Nora something she filed away carefully. By firelight, They talked through what they had. The sheep were feral enough to be difficult. Descended from domestic animals someone's flock lost or abandoned. Maybe a herder who hadn't survived the high country. Maybe stock that had wandered through a passage no one else had found and then could not find again. They had multiplied here over years, maybe many years. Fat and healthy, but completely unhandled. Dale said, "We can't drive them out, not through that slot. They'd scatter into every canyon in the maze and we'd lose them all." Nora said, "So we don't drive them. We gentle them first. Here, where they're calm, where soot can work." Dale looked at the dog sitting at the edge of the firelight with the flock at his back. He said, "And then we see what he actually does. They found out at dawn." Nora woke early, found Dale already awake watching the valley. The light coming down from the eastern rim filling the valley slowly from the top down, turning the grass from gray to green as it went. She tried to move 3 sheep toward the stream. The whole flock exploded. 50 animals suddenly going in 15 directions, and Dale was on his feet waving his arms, which helped nothing, and Nora was saying, "Stop, stop, that makes it worse," and it was objectively a complete disaster. Then Soot went to work. He did not run. He did not bark or snap or do anything that any working dog they had ever seen would have done. He walked, slow, low, his belly nearly brushing the grass. He placed himself not behind the sheep, but alongside them, and then slightly ahead, and then at a small angle that Nora's eye could not quite decode, but that the sheep apparently understood perfectly. He did not chase, he guided. The way water finds the downhill, the way a current carries without forcing. The scattered animals slowed, looked at him, and then in ones and twos, and then in larger groups, they began to drift back together, back toward the stream, back into a loose, quiet cluster that was not panicked and not running and not scattered to the canyon walls. Within an hour, the whole flock stood in a calm group near the water. Soot sat at the edge of them, not triumphant, not even particularly interested in being noticed, just present, just there. Dale stood beside Nora, and they looked at this together. He said, "I have never seen anything like that." She said, "He's not a driving dog. He's a gathering dog. The old kind, before they bred for the nipping and the pushing. He doesn't move them by frightening them. He moves them by making them feel safe enough to move on their own." Dale watched Soot sit among the calmly grazing sheep. He said, "And Pruitt couldn't use him because," Nora said, "because Pruitt had nothing for him to gather. He had driving dogs, an open range, and a style of working that had no place for what Soot does." She looked at the dog. "He's been waiting his whole life for a flock to keep. And here they were, the whole time, waiting for him." Dale was quiet a moment. Then he said, "You were right." She looked at him. He said it again, steadily, the way Dale said things he meant. "You were right, Nora, from the beginning. I'm sorry I made it harder than it needed to be." She put her hand on his arm, didn't say anything, didn't need to. What followed was the hardest stretch of weeks they had ever known, because knowing what they had was not the same as having it. Not yet, not nearly. They could not simply walk away from their cabin and their cattle to live in the valley. So they built a rhythm brutal and exhausting. Days in the valley, working the flock, letting Soot do his slow, patient work, the sheep growing incrementally less wild under his steady presence. Then the long trek back through the slot canyons to tend the cattle and the homestead. Then back again. The trail through Redwall Rim was punishing every time. They wore rope raw. The horse grew to hate the slot with a specific and articulate hatred that it expressed on every approach. Nora's back ached from the pack weight on the steep passages. Dale's hands cracked and bled in the cold, the ropes and the rock faces taking turns on his skin. They began to stack small cairns at the canyon junctions, knee-high piles of flat stones marking each turn, each hidden gap, building a map in stone of the route only Soot had known. November arrived, and it arrived hard. The first real snow came on a Tuesday. Light. 6 inches. Enough to make the canyon trail treacherous. Enough to coat the hidden passages so that the stone looked all the same color and the gaps were harder to find. They came stumbling out of Redwall Rim that evening, both of them half frozen, the horse trembling, and not forgiving anyone for this, Soot, the only one who appeared to find the whole enterprise reasonable. Inside the cabin, Dale built the fire, and Nora made coffee, and they sat across from each other at the kitchen table without speaking for a long time. Dale finally said, "We can't get enough out before spring. Not at this rate." She said, "I know." He said, "A few head at a time through that canyon in this weather. We need hands and equipment and a proper operation. We need partners or capital or both. We need time we don't have." She said, "I know." He said, "The bank letter." She said, "I know, Dale." He said, "We found a fortune we can't carry home." He pressed his palms against his eyes. She watched him, the firelight moving on his face, the lines in it. 7 years of Wyoming wind and hard work, and the particular aging that comes from caring about things that might not work out. She said, "We'll figure it out." He said with his palms still over his eyes, "I know we will. I need a minute to be tired first." She got up and poured more coffee and put it in front of him and sat back down. Outside, the wind came off the Harrow Hills and rattled the cabin window in its frame, and the fire popped, and Soot lay across the threshold the way he always did, the doorway his to manage thank you, and no one was getting in or out without his awareness. She looked at the dog, his gray-black coat, his one good ear and one folded ear, and his enormous paws, and his back with its slight apologetic curve. She thought, "I wonder what Gideon Pruitt would say right now." She thought, "I know exactly what Gideon Pruitt would say. He'd say he always knew that dog had something. He absolutely would. He'd believe it completely. And she'd smile and let him believe it." She thought, "I wonder if anyone is going to believe any of this." She thought, "Someone will find out. Things like this don't stay secret. This country is too small, and we look too different coming home. We smell like sheep. We've got wool on our sleeves." Dale bought shears last week at the Harrow Falls supply store, and I saw Rutherford Ames watching from across the street, and his eyes were asking questions that his mouth was too polite to ask yet. She was right about that. The news moved the way news always moves in a country where land and livestock are everything. Slowly at first, then faster than seemed possible. It started small. A neighbor saw them descending from the rim with packed bags and unfamiliar smells. A hand at the feed store noticed the sheer purchases. Someone mentioned it to someone else at the Harrow Falls post office, and that someone knew someone at the cattle auction, and it traveled from there. It reached Warren Holt in 9 days. Holt arrived on a Thursday afternoon, late enough in the day that the light was going, and Nora had to shade her eyes against the low sun to see him clearly. He came on a horse that cost more than their wagon and tack combined, sitting the saddle with the ease of a man who has never had to worry about whether he could afford the horse under him. He was not physically large. That surprised people who knew his reputation. Medium height, trim, gray at the temples. A face that was pleasant by default, which was more dangerous, Nora had always thought, than a face that was unpleasant. Unpleasant faces warned you. Pleasant faces kept you from preparing. Dale came out of the barn and stood in the yard. Holt said, "Calfield, I've been hearing things." Dale said, "People talk." Holt said, They do. They say you've been spending considerable time up in the rim country. Strange hobby for a cattleman with chores at home. Dale said, "Our business is our own." Holt's eyes moved, slow and thorough, taking in the yard, the new shears by the barn wall, the wool caught in the fence rail from the last trip home. The way Dale was standing square and careful, which was how Dale stood when he was being careful. Holt said, "Of course it is. I only mention it because I happen to hold paper on some grazing rights up in that country. Old claims. Most people have forgotten them. I keep my records." He smiled, a pleasant smile on a pleasant face. He said, "If someone were to find something valuable in those hills, something that touched my old claims, well, the courts would need to work out the particulars, and courts are slow things, expensive things. A small operation like yours could spend everything it had just on lawyers long before any judge put his name to a decision." Nora had come to stand in the cabin doorway. She said, "The valley isn't on your claims." She said it before she meant to, before she knew for certain it was true. But she said it steady, and she looked at him straight, and she did not blink. Holt looked at her, the pleasant face registering her for the first time, reassessing. He said, "Perhaps not. Perhaps so. It would be a shame to sink everything you've got into finding out which. When the bank is already asking questions, I hear." He gathered his reins, smooth and unhurried. He said, "My offer on this property still stands. Fair price. You could walk away clean, instead of the alternative." He tipped his hat, rode out at a walk, the expensive horse disappearing into the early dark. Nora and Dale stood in the yard after he was gone. The silence was the kind you step into carefully. Dale said, "He doesn't know exactly what we found." She said no, but he knows it's something worth threatening us over. Dale said, "His claims can't reach the valley, can they?" She said, "I don't know yet." He said, "Nora." She said, "I don't know yet, but I'm going to find out." 3 days later, the second blow landed. It was a clear afternoon, colder than the previous week, the sky that hard, flat blue that comes before serious weather. Dale had gone up to bring down 4 sheep they'd been gradually gentling near the valley entrance. Small progress, but progress. Nora was splitting wood behind the cabin when she heard him come back through the yard. The sound was wrong. She came around the corner and found him on the ground beside the horse, sitting, his left hand braced on the frozen dirt, his right hand gripping his ankle, his face the color of old ash. She was beside him in 4 strides. He said through his teeth, "Wet rock, just wet rock. I know better." She got down beside him, touched the ankle, felt the way he flinched and went rigid. She said, "How bad?" He said, "Bad enough." The sheep were gone, scattered back into the maze. 3 weeks of slow, gentle work undone in the minutes it took for Dale to help himself to the ground. She got him inside, got the boot off carefully, which was its own ordeal that neither of them would fully describe to anyone afterward. Wrapped the ankle, got him into the chair by the fire, with his foot up and his coffee in his hand, and his jaw set in the particular way that meant he was in significant pain and refusing to acknowledge the full extent of it. He said, "I'll be up in a day or 2. She said, "You'll be up in a week minimum." He said, "A few days." She said, "Dale." He said, "I know." He did know. She could see it in the way he looked at the fire. Not the look of a man calculating recovery. The look of a man calculating damage. All the sheep scattered back into the canyons, his ankle swollen to twice its size. Winter tightening around them. The bank's patience thinning. Holt's threat still in the air. He said quietly,
This is too much for us, Nora. We're not big enough for this.
She didn't say anything. He said, "Maybe Holt's right. Maybe we take his money and walk." The fire popped. Soot got up from his place at the door and crossed the room and pressed himself against Dale's side, that great, clumsy head finding the space between Dale's ribs and his arm. And Dale put his arm around the dog without thinking about it, the way you put your arm around something that is simply there and warm when you are cold and tired. Nora looked at her husband, 58 years old, married to him for 31 of them. She knew this man better than she knew any other living thing, including herself sometimes. She knew when he was done, and she knew when he only believed he was done, and those were two different things, and what she was looking at right now was the second one. She said, "Get some rest." He said, "Nora." She said, "Rest first. Then we figure out what comes next." He looked at her. Something moved across his face. Not agreement. Not yet. But the beginning of it. He leaned back, closed his eyes. Soot stayed pressed against him. Nora sat for a while, watching the fire, watching her husband sleep in his chair with the dog keeping him company. Then the third blow landed. It came with the supply rider from Harrow Falls, the same way the bank letter had come in September, bundled in with the ordinary business of life. A single letter. The Harrow County Bank letterhead, clean and formal and cold. She read it, standing in the cold at the door where the rider had handed it to her. She read it again. Warren Holt had purchased the Caulfield loan from the bank, the debt in full. He now held the note. As holder of the note, he was calling it due. Payment in full 30 days from the date of the letter or forfeiture of the Caulfield property. 30 days. Not spring. 30 days. She stood in the doorway with the letter in her hands and the cold coming in around her and the sound of Dale breathing in his chair and Soot watching her from across the room with his mismatched eyes. 30 days. Deep in November, with her husband's ankle in pieces, with the flock scattered back into the canyons with no way to bring enough sheep out through the snow and the slot rock in 30 days to raise the kind of money that would pay Holt back his own weapon. She thought, he didn't need the courts after all. She thought, he just bought the rope and handed us the noose. She folded the letter very carefully, put it in her coat pocket, closed the cabin door against the cold, stood in the middle of the room for a moment looking at nothing. Then she went outside. The snow had started while she was reading the letter. Light and fine. November snow, the serious kind, the kind that was not asking whether you were ready. Settling on the roof of the barn. Settling on the fence posts. Settling on the ground between the cabin and the edge of the land where Soot had sat every morning for 3 weeks watching the north. She walked to that spot, stood there, looked north toward Redwall Rim, dark against the gray sky, keeping its valley, keeping its flock, keeping its secret. She had been so certain. She had staked their land on a strange dog's gaze. And she had been right, gloriously, impossibly right, and it was not going to be enough. Being right was not enough. The world did not stop for people who were right. It stopped for people with money, with lawyers, with the patience to wait out anyone who didn't have those things. She had found a valley full of sheep, and she was going to lose her home anyway. The snow came down around her fine and relentless. Soot came and sat beside her in the snow. Not in the house where it was warm. Out here, in the cold, in the fading light beside her. She looked down at him, his coat collecting snowflakes, his breath coming in small clouds. his mismatched ears, his crooked back, his enormous patient paws. This animal that every rancher in the county had assessed and found lacking and passed over and walked away from. They had all looked at him and decided what he was. Every single one of them. And every single one of them had been wrong. Folks who looked at the rim saw dead country. Wrong. Folks who looked at Soot saw a useless dog. Wrong. Folks who looked at the caulfields saw people too small to matter. Wrong. And Holt, who had looked at their debt and seen a weapon, Holt had done something else too, hadn't he? He had spent real money, his own, buying that debt, which meant he believed what was behind it was worth more than what he'd paid. He had told her with his own money that the valley was real and valuable and worth taking seriously. He had shown her his whole hand. She stood in the snow and felt something shift. Slow at first, the way ice shifts in spring, deep and structural, before anything at the surface shows. Then faster. She turned and walked back to the cabin, her feet certain on the frozen ground. She pushed open the door. Dale was awake, looking at her from his chair, his face carrying everything he'd been thinking while she was outside. She said, "He made a mistake." Dale said, "Nora."
She said, "Holt, buying our debt. He made a mistake." She sat down across from him and leaned forward. "He thinks he trapped us. But what he actually did was tell us with his own money that he believes the valley is ours to lose." Dale said, "We can't pay him back in 30 days. She said, "Not alone." He said. Then she said, "Not alone." "Dale?" She looked at him steadily. He looked back, and she watched him see what she was seeing. Slowly, and then all at once. He said, "You're going to make him our problem." She said, "I'm going to make him everyone's problem." Outside, the snow came down. Inside, the fire burned. And Soot lay across the threshold, with his head on his paws, guarding the door the way he guarded everything. Patient, certain, already knowing something they were only just beginning to understand. She left before Dale woke up. Not because she was hiding anything, because there was no time to explain what she hadn't finished thinking through yet. And because Dale would ask questions. Good questions. Reasonable questions. The kind that would slow her down when she needed to move. She left a note. 3 words. Gone to town. Soot watched her go from the doorway. She looked back at him once, his one good ear up, his one folded ear doing what it always did. His mismatched eyes steady on her face. She said quietly, so as not to wake Dale, keep him company. Soot stepped back inside and lay down beside Dale's chair. Good enough. The ride to Harrow Falls took 2 hours in the early morning cold. The snow from the night before had stopped, but left the road packed and white, and the horse's breath came in long, rolling clouds. And Nora's fingers went numb inside her gloves by the first mile, and she didn't stop to warm them. No time. 27 days. The county land office sat on the north end of Harrow Falls Main Street, between the assay office and a hardware store that had been there since before anyone currently living could remember. A small building, brown paint going gray. A sign so weathered the letters were more suggestion than fact. The clerk inside was a young man of about 30, with ink-stained fingers and the look of someone who had organized more paper than any human should have to, and had developed strong opinions about filing systems as a result. He looked at Nora when she came in. She said, "I need the plat records for the Redwall Rim parcels. All of them. Every grazing claim filed in that section going back 40 years. He said, That's quite a few files, ma'am. She said I have all day. He blinked. She sat down at the long table, and he brought her the files. Box after box. Dusty and thick and organized by the previous system, which was optimistically called a system. She opened the first one. She read. She was not a fast reader in the way people mean when they say fast reader. She was the other kind. The kind who reads every word and remembers it. The kind who notices when something is missing. Who catches the one sentence in 40 pages that contradicts everything around it. The kind of reading that is actually a form of listening. Listening to what the document is trying not to say. She read for 6 hours. The clerk brought her coffee at noon without being asked. She looked up startled and found him watching her with an expression she recognized as professional curiosity. He had been watching what she was reading. Not the content, the way she was reading it. She said, "Thank you." He said, "Can I ask what you're looking for?" She said, "Old grazing claims in the northern section, specifically around the rim country." He said, "Holt's claims." She went still. He said quickly, "I'm not. I only mention it because those came through here about 3 weeks ago." He had them certified. New certifications on old paperwork. She said, "Who certified them?" He named a name, a county official, someone she noted who played cards on Friday nights with Warren Holt. She noted this without expression. She said, "Thank you for the coffee." She went back to reading, and at 3 in the afternoon, in the 42nd folder of the Northern Section Plat Records, she found it. The original survey of Redwall Rim Country, 1893. A government survey team, the kind that came through in those years, marking everything for future reference, drawing lines through land they had never walked and would never walk again using instruments in triangulation and best estimates. She found the boundary line of Holt's grazing claim, traced it with her finger, followed it north along the western face of the rim, then east, then south. Closing the boundary. The hidden valley sat 300 yards north of Holt's claim line. 300 yards. His paper touched nothing that mattered. His carefully certified, recently refreshed, decades-old grazing rights reached to within sight of what she needed and stopped. She sat back, let out a breath she had been holding for 3 days.
The valley was on open federal range, unclaimed, unregistered, free to any person willing to file a homestead or grazing application with the Territorial Land Office. Which was, she noted, a different office from the County Land Office. 40 miles east, in a town called Ridgecrest. 27 days. She could make Ridgecrest in a day if she pushed, but there was something she needed to do first. She closed the folders, stacked them with care, thanked the ink-stained clerk by name, which she had learned from the placard on his desk, which she had read on the way in, because she read everything. She went out into the late afternoon cold, and turned not toward home, but toward the Pruitt place, 6 miles south. Gideon Pruitt was in his yard when she arrived, moving a water trough with the help of one of his hands, the kind of late afternoon work that happens because it has to happen regardless of the hour. He looked up when she rode in, looked at her horse, looked at her face. He said, "Mrs. Caulfield." She said, "Gideon. I need to tell you something." He told the hand to go on ahead. The hand went. Gideon leaned against the water trough and crossed his arms and waited with the patience of a man who has spent most of his life waiting on animals and weather and has gotten reasonably good at it. She told him, not everything, the right things, in the right order. She told him the dog he had given away for free had led them through Redwall Rim. She told him what was on the other side. She told him how many sheep, how much grass, how much water. She told him what Warren Holt had done with their banknote and what he wanted and why. She told him that the valley sat on open federal range, not on Holt's claims. She told him she was going to file for it.
but that she needed partners with capital and hands and equipment, and that she would rather stand in a room with people she had known for years than hand Holt any more time to find a different angle. Gideon listened to all of this without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Long enough that she heard the wind in the fence wire and a horse shifting in the nearest stall, and one of his dogs somewhere in the back of the property barking at something. He said finally, "That dog found all that." She said, "That dog knew where it was the whole time. He just needed someone willing to follow him." Another silence. He said, "I gave him away." She said, "You did?" He said, "He was right there on my property for 3 months, and I tied him to a post." She said, "Gideon." He looked up. She said, "You didn't know what he was. You looked at him and saw what he couldn't do." Lots of people would have done the same. Most people would have done the same. She paused. "But if you'd like to be the kind of person who doesn't make that mistake twice, then here's your chance." He looked at her a moment longer. Then he uncrossed his arms and put out his hand. She shook it. He said, "Who else are you talking to?" She said, "Hester Crane." "Boyd Whitmore." He said, "Smart. Both of them have history with Holt." She said, "I know." He said, "He sold Whitmore a water right that turned out to be half what he claimed. 1904. She said, "I know." He said, "And Hester Crane?" She said, "I know about Hester too. That's why I'm going there next." He looked at her with an expression she'd seen before on the faces of men who had underestimated her, and then suddenly, in one specific moment, understood the full extent of what that had cost them. Not Gideon Pruitt's best evening, probably. But he got there. He said, "I'll be at whatever meeting you call." She said, "County Land Office. Harrow Falls. 8 days from now." He said, "I'll be there." Hester Crane was 64 years old and had run her family's sheep operation alone since her husband passed in 1901, and had done so with a competence so thorough that it made people uncomfortable, which she had long since stopped noticing. She listened to Nora's story at her kitchen table over coffee that was strong enough to hold a spoon upright, and she didn't interrupt once. And when Nora finished, Hester sat back and said 3 things. First, Holt. Second, of course. Third, I'm in. Boyd Whitmore took a little longer. He was a careful man. He asked questions, good ones. He wanted to see the plat evidence. Nora showed him the copies she had made at the land office, her own handwritten transcription of the boundary lines, precise and clear. He read them twice. Then he said what everyone kept saying in their own way. He said, "All this over a dog nobody would have." Nora said, "All this because one woman would." He looked at her. Then he smiled, slow and wide. He said, "I'll be at the meeting." She rode home in the dark. 14 hours in the saddle. Her back ached at a frequency that had its own note. Her fingers had been numb since mid-morning and were only now beginning to feel like fingers again. The horse knew the way home and took it steadily, and she led it. She thought about Dale. She thought about the note she'd left. 3 words. She thought, he is going to have thoughts about that note. Several thoughts, in a row. Followed by opinions. She thought, I will deal with that when I get home. She got home near midnight. The cabin light was on. Dale was at the table, ankle-propped coffee in hand. Stood at his feet, face carrying the accumulated thoughts and opinions she had predicted. She came in, closed the door, started unwrapping her coat. Dale said, "Gone to town. She said I was going to write more, but I was in a hurry." He said, "It's midnight." She said, "The Pruitt place is 6 miles past Harrow Falls." Pause. He said, "You went to see Gideon Pruitt." She said, "And Hester Crane and Boyd Whitmore." A longer pause. He said, "Nora." She sat down across from him, looked at him straight, and she told him everything. The plat records, the boundary line, 300 yards, the open federal range, the filing she needed to make in Ridgecrest, the meeting she had called at the county land office in 8 days. He listened the way he always listened, still and complete, not interrupting. When she finished, the cabin was quiet except for the fire. He said Holt's claim doesn't reach the valley. She said, "By 300 yards," he said. "And you have copies of the original survey?" She said, "In my coat pocket." He said, "And Pruitt, Crane, and Whitmore are coming to the meeting." She said, "All 3. Another silence. He said, "And you did all of this in one day?" She said, "I had a lot of coffee." Something moved across his face, the tired lines of it shifting. Something coming through that was not quite a smile and not quite tears, and was very specifically Dale Caulfield, arriving at the end of his own resistance. He said, "Nora." She waited. He said, "You saw what he couldn't do, and you took him home anyway. And you were right." She knew he wasn't only talking about Soot. She said, "I've been looking at the wrong things my whole life and finding the right ones anyway." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. She said, "Get some sleep. You need the ankle down." He said, "You need sleep more than I do." She said, "Probably true. Non-negotiable." He said, "Nora." She said, "I'm filing for the grazing claim in Ridgecrest tomorrow. The meeting is 8 days. Sleep." He looked at her a long moment. Then he squeezed her hand and let go. She went to Ridgecrest the next morning. She filed the grazing application on open federal range in the northern section of Harrow Hills Territory. The land office there was bigger than the county one, staffed by 2 clerks who were efficient and thorough, and who asked no questions about why a woman of 58 was riding in alone on a cold November morning to file a claim on range that backed up against the worst terrain in the county. They asked the questions the paperwork required. She answered them. She walked out with a receipt and a copy of the filed application and the particular feeling of a person who has just placed all of their remaining chips on a number and is waiting for the wheel to stop. Not afraid. Past afraid. Past the place where afraid lives. Into the place on the other side of it, which has no common name, but which Nora had visited once or twice before. The place that is just clear, just certain, just the next thing, and then the next thing after that. The 8 days passed. Dale's ankle improved enough for him to move with a cane. Not enough for the canyon trail, which meant Nora went into the rim alone twice in those 8 days. Once to check the flock still there, Soot's scent apparently doing something useful even in his absence, the sheep calmer than expected. Once to begin marking the trail more thoroughly, stacking the cairns larger, more visible, preparing for the day when other hands would need to follow them. Hard days. Cold days. Days where she came home so tired, she ate standing at the stove because sitting down meant not getting back up. But the meeting was coming. And Warren Holt had been told. Not by her. By the way information moves in small towns, which is faster than anyone intends. He knew there was a meeting at the county land office. He knew who had been invited. He didn't know exactly what she had found in those 42 folders of plat records. He thought he did. That was the difference. The morning of the meeting came gray and cold and certain. Nora dressed in her good wool skirt, the dark blue one, the one she wore to church and to meetings that mattered. Dale put on his best shirt, despite the cane, and despite Nora telling him he didn't need to dress up, which he ignored with the dignity of a man who knows when he needs to look like himself. Soot got in the wagon without being asked. Nora looked at him settled in the wagon bed, facing forward for once, ears up, nose reading the cold air. She said, You're coming. He looked at her. She said, All right then. They arrived at the Harrow County Land Office at 8:45. Gideon Pruitt was already there, standing outside, with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man who has decided to do the right thing and is determined to look comfortable about it even if he isn't. Hester Crane arrived at 8:50 punctual as a clock and dressed for business, which meant her good coat and the look on her face that had made men reconsider poor decisions for 20 years. Boyd Whitmore came at 8:55 with a copy of Nora's plat transcriptions in his breast pocket and the water rights grievance from 1904, apparently still fresh enough to fuel something useful. The territorial land agent, a man named Aldous Fenn, came from his office down the street, having received Nora's written request for his presence 4 days ago. He was 70 spare and had the quality of a man who had seen enough disputes over land to have no patience for theater. The banker, a new man brought in from Ridgecrest after the previous bank manager retired, came last, just before 9. Young, thorough, the kind of banker who reads the paperwork all the way to the end. Warren Holt arrived at 9 o'clock exactly. He came through the door and stopped, took in the room. Gideon Pruitt, Hester Crane, Boyd Whitmore, Aldous Fenn from the land office, the new banker, and Nora Calfield standing in front of a table with a map on it, her husband beside her with his cane, and a large gray-black dog of extremely improbable appearance sitting at her feet like he owned the floor. Holt's pleasant face did something complicated. He recovered it. Fast. The face reassembled itself into its default expression, smooth and easy, and giving nothing away. He said, "Mrs. Caulfield, what a thorough gathering." She said, "Thank you for coming, Mr. Holt." He found a seat, crossed his legs, looked at the map on the table with the expression of a man who has not yet decided how much he knows. Nora began. She did not raise her voice. She did not perform. She had not prepared a speech. She had prepared evidence which was better. She laid the certified copy of the original 1893 survey on the table. She laid her transcription of Holt's claim boundaries beside it. She placed them so that Aldous Fenn could see both clearly, which he did, leaning forward with his spectacles and tracing the lines with a practiced eye. She said, "The valley located north of Redwall Rim's primary ridge lies entirely on open federal range. The nearest boundary of Mr. Holt's grazing claims ends here." She pointed, 312 yards south of the valley's southern edge as measured by the 1893 survey. She looked at Holt. She said, "Mr. Holt purchased our banknote 11 days ago and called it due in 30 days, citing she had the letter." She placed it on the table, the accelerated terms available to a new debt holder under the county lending agreement. "We do not dispute his right to do so." She paused. She said, "We dispute his right to the valley." Holt said pleasantly, "Mrs. Caulfield, I have certified copies of my grazing rights. Recently certified. The boundaries, as I understand them." She said, "As you understand them, Mr. Holt?" She looked at Aldous Fenn. He said, without looking up from the survey copy, "The 1893 survey is the authoritative document for this section. County certifications of claim boundaries are filed against it." He turned the paper, slightly adjusted his spectacles. "The boundary as drawn here would place the northern parcel." He tapped the location of the valley outside the Holt claim area. The room was quiet. Holt uncrossed his legs. "Crossed them the other way." He said, "Survey lines from 1893 are not always precise. There can be questions of interpretation, of instrument error. A court would want to consider." Gideon Pruitt said, without particular heat, "I've ranged that country for 30 years, Holt. I know where your claims run." "You know where your claims run?" The question is whether everyone else in this room knows it now, too. Something shifted in the room. The pleasant quality of Holt's face was doing real work now, maintaining itself against pressure. He said, "There are still the matter of the debt. 30 days is..." The new banker cleared his throat. He said, "I've reviewed the loan history." He opened his folder. The original terms of the Caulfield note include a provision that the note returns to negotiated terms upon challenge of the acquiring holder's collateral claims. He looked up. If the validity of Mr. Holt's interest in the surrounding property is in dispute, a dispute now a matter of record in this office, the 30-day call period is suspended pending resolution. Silence. Nora had found that provision on day 2 of the 8 days. She had written to the new banker on day 3. He had replied on day 5. Holt was looking at the table now. The survey copy, the boundary lines. Gideon Pruitt, Hester Crane, Boyd Whitmore, who had said nothing and whose silence was of a specific quality that anyone with a long memory understood. He was counting. He was a businessman. Before he was anything else, he was a man who counted. And what he was counting right now was the number of ways this room had closed around him while he walked through the door, thinking he was arriving for a surrender. He said very quietly, "You filed the grazing claim." She said, "6 days ago." He said, "With the territorial office." She said, "In Ridgecrest." "Yes." He said, "Before this meeting." She said, "The meeting needed to be about what you owe us, Mr. Holt, not about what we're claiming. Those are different conversations." He looked at her. For a moment, his face did something she hadn't seen it do before. The pleasant surface dropped away entirely. And what was underneath was not rage, not malice, something more complicated than either. The look of a man who is very good at the game he plays and has just encountered someone who learned the rules by watching him play it and played it better. He looked at Soot. Soot sat at Nora's feet with his one good ear up and his one folded ear doing its usual thing, and his enormous paws square on the floor of the Harrow County Land Office. Calm as still water. Looking at nothing in particular with the patient certainty of an animal that had already known how this ended. Holt said, "All of this, over a dog nobody wanted." Nora said no. He looked at her. She said, "Over a dog that everyone looked at wrong." The room held that. Holt picked up his hat, turned it once in his hands, that smooth, unhurried movement of a man who is deciding which version of himself to be in the next 30 seconds. He said, "I'll take repayment, full amount, by the agreed date." He stood. He said, "Good day, Mrs. Caulfield." He walked out. The door closed. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Hester Crane made a small sound that might have been a laugh and poured herself more coffee from the pot on the side table. Gideon Pruitt looked at his boots and said something quiet to them. Boyd Whitmore unfolded from his chair and shook Dale's hand, and then turned to Nora and shook hers and held it an extra second. Aldous Finn collected his papers and said, "I'll have the survey confirmation filed by end of week. The grazing application should clear in 30 days, given no dispute is registered." The banker said, "I'll send written confirmation of the suspended terms today." And then they all left one by one, back into the cold, gray Harrow Falls morning. Until it was just Nora and Dale and Soot in the county land office, and the map on the table, and the quiet. Dale said, "You knew about the provision, the 30-day suspension clause." She said, "I found it on day 2. He said, "And you wrote the banker." She said, "Day 3. He said, "And arranged everything before the meeting, so that by the time Holt walked in," she said, "the room was already the room I needed it to be." He was quiet a moment. Then he said, "Nora Caulfield." She said, "Dale Caulfield." He said, "I married a remarkable woman." She said, "You did. And you've occasionally required reminding." He laughed, and it sounded like the laugh in the valley, startled and real. She folded the map, put it in her bag. The survey copy, the bank letter, the filed application receipt, all of it carefully. Then she looked at Suet. He was already standing. "Ready," she said. "Let's go home." The spring that followed was the spring that changed everything. Not all at once. Nothing real happens all at once. It happened the way valleys go green slowly and then completely, and then you can't remember what it looked like before. The partnership formed in the weeks after the meeting. The Caulfields and Gideon Pruitt and Hester Crane, with Boyd Whitmore supplying capital in exchange for a share of the first 3 years' wool. They brought hands and equipment to Redwall Rim, widened the worst passages, built proper cairn markers all the way through head height and unmistakable, raised shearing sheds in the cottonwood groves by the stream, the timber brought in, piece by piece through the slot, and assembled by men who were by the end of it very tired of the slot. Soot worked through all of it, gathering the flock each morning with that slow, low, patient certainty that had not changed since the first morning in the valley. Keeping the wild sheep calm through the noise and confusion of construction, guarding the lambs at night, moving through the growing flock like a current present everywhere and insistent about nothing. Gideon Pruitt's hands watched him work and said nothing for a week. Then one of them, a tall man named Vickers, who had worked sheep for 20 years and had opinions about dogs, said to Nora, "I have never seen anything like that." And he meant it the way a man means something he has revised a long opinion to accommodate. Gideon himself said it to Nora one afternoon when the shearing was well underway and the first bales were taking shape and the valley smelled like wool and cut grass and the particular cleanness of mountain water. He said, "I found him half dead on the high pass, brought him in, tried him on the work I knew." He said this looking out across the valley, not at her. "He didn't do what I needed, so I decided he was useless." He paused. "You're telling me he was up there because the flock was up there, because he'd been with them or near them before someone lost him, because he knew the way back the whole time?" She said, "That's what I believe." He said, "And I tied him to a post and let him half starve." She said, "Gideon." He said, "I'm not asking for absolution, I'm making a point." She waited. He said, "I looked at that dog and saw what he couldn't do for me. You looked at that dog and saw what he already knew." He turned to her. "That's not a small difference, Mrs. Caulfield. That's the whole thing. That's the difference between missing something and finding it." She didn't answer. Because some things don't need an answer. They just need someone to hear them and not fill the space with more words. The debt to Warren Holt was paid in full on the 28th day. Not the 30th, the 28th. Not because they had to, because Nora chose to. There was no ceremony to it. A bank transfer arranged through the new man in Ridgecrest. Clean, complete. Holt sent no acknowledgement, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. That was the last they heard from him. By summer, the Caulfield 40 acres had a new identity. Not a cattle ranch on unsuitable ground. The eastern access to the Redwall Rim operation. The gateway. The place where the trail started and the wool came down and the partnership did its business with the world outside the stone walls. Hard land, rocky, ungenerous in the old ways. But it had never needed to be generous in the old ways. It just needed to be the right land for the right purpose. Which it was. Which it had always been. Nora thought about that sometimes. How the 40 acres had always been exactly what it needed to be, and they had spent 7 years trying to make it into something else, because it looked like cattle country looked, or how they imagined cattle country should look. And it wasn't, and nothing they did was going to make it so. But it was perfect, absolutely and completely perfect, as the front door to something no one else could see. You had to look right. That was all. You just had to look right. The autumn came in gold and cold and clean.
October again. A year past the October when Nora had stood on the porch with cold coffee watching a strange dog stare north. The same hills, the same angle of morning light, the same thin bite in the air that meant winter was considering its options. Different everything else. She walked up to the valley one afternoon, alone. Through the rim passages she now knew so well she could walk them in the dark, and had once in December, which she did not recommend, but which she had survived. She came out of the slot into the valley and stood on the low rise at its edge. Below her, the valley in October. The stream catching the late sun. The cottonwoods in full gold leaves coming down in slow drifts across the water. The shearing sheds standing solid among the trees. The flock spread across the grass in the long amber light. Hundreds of animals, now the wild count grown and joined by animals Hester Crane had moved up from her own operation, the valley big enough and rich enough to hold them all. Sound of the stream. Sound of the wind in the cottonwood leaves. Sound of the sheep, that particular soft, constant murmur of a flock at peace. Footsteps behind her. Dale came up beside her, moving well now the cane long since left by the cabin door. His face in the October light, all the lines of it, all the years in it. The man she had married at 27 and argued with and built things with and lost sleep over and chosen again every year in the quiet way you choose someone when there's no ceremony to make it official. Just the daily decision. Just the turning toward. He slipped his arm around her. They stood like that and looked at the valley. He said after a while, "You know what I keep thinking about?" she said. "What?" He said, "That note I've left on the table." 3 words. She said, "Gone to town." He said, "Gone to town." He was quiet a moment. "I woke up and my wife was gone, and there was a note that said, 'Gone to town,' and the dog was sitting next to my chair, looking at me like I was supposed to know what was happening." She said, "You did know what was happening." He said I had a theory. She said it was the right theory. He said, "Mostly." She said, "Entirely." He said, "Largely." She laughed, and then, down on the rise, where the grass met the stone at the valley's edge, soot appeared. He had been somewhere in the valley, working, or resting, or simply being present among the flock in the way he was always present. He came up the slope at his particular gait, that rolling, slightly apologetic walk, that his crooked back gave him the one that had made Gideon Pruitt's hands laugh in the early days, and that nobody laughed at anymore. He came up and sat down beside Nora. She looked down at him. His muzzle was going gray, the first silver coming in at the edges of the black. His coat was still the same impossible patchwork. It had always been gray and black and dirty white. No part of it matching any other part, the ears still their own separate decisions. His enormous paws planted on the grass like he had decided this particular patch of ground was his to sit on. He was looking at the flock. Not the hills, not the horizon, not the north. The flock that was his. That had been waiting for him in the hidden valley while he sat at the edge of the Caulfield land every morning looking toward it. That he had never stopped knowing was there. That he had waited with the patience of something that had given up on being understood and had simply kept knowing anyway until the right person finally looked. Nora sat down in the grass beside him, her good skirt, the dark blue one. She sat down in it anyway. She put her hand on his back, felt the warmth of him.
the familiar curve of his spine, the way he leaned just slightly into the touch. She thought about Lau Amos Brierly and his stick and his white beard and the thing he had said at the fence in September a year ago. A creature folks overlook is not necessarily a creature with nothing to offer. Mostly, it's just a creature nobody looked at long enough to find out what it has. She had looked. That was all she had done. She had looked longer and different and less afraid of being wrong, and everything else had followed from that. The valley, the flock, the partnership, the debt paid, the 40 acres transformed from a failure into a door. All of it from one decision to look past the surface of a mismatched, crooked-backed, impractical dog that everyone else had already assessed and dismissed. She thought about all the things people had told her she was wrong about over the years. The land, the dog, the direction to go when things got hard. She thought about Dale in his chair with the bank letter and the look on his face that meant he had run the numbers and the numbers did not work. She thought, the numbers only don't work if you're counting the wrong things. She thought, that's all it ever was, just counting the wrong things. Dale sat down beside her, on the good grass in the October light in his good shirt without the cane, his ankle long since healed, and the memory of that dark November night, becoming already the kind of story you tell differently each time you tell it. The version where you knew it would work out. The version where you were never really afraid. She knew the real version. The real version was standing in the snow with a letter in her hands, thinking this is the end. The real version was crying in the dark while a dog sat beside her and didn't ask her to explain herself. The real version was gone to town on a horse in the freezing morning with numb fingers and 27 days and the wild certainty of a woman who had nothing left to lose except the one thing she had always had. The ability to look at something everyone else had dismissed and see it whole. Soot's tail moved against the grass, once, twice. The valley spread before them gold and green and full. The stream caught the last of the afternoon light and threw it back at the sky. And the flock grazed on in the long October quiet, unhurried and complete, tended by a dog that everyone had once called useless on land, that everyone had once called worthless, found by a woman that everyone had once looked past. Not anymore. Not ever again.